Um, we have a fascinating session with a fine group of speakers, experts. But Cliff and Andrey, on your behalf and my behalf, first I want to thank the organizers and Princess Ibtisam Al-Kitbi for this wonderful forum and giving us the opportunity to discuss such an important topic. Mr. Clifford Kupchan and Andrey Kortunov, you can read their biography in detail, but they are more famous than to be introduced. I'm going to start with a question. I'm going to bombard you with other questions later, but sort something out for me. When we talk about Russia, Russia did this, did that, strategy, this, that. Are we talking about Russian state and its security as a country, or are we talking about President Putin and whatever sentiment goes with that? In other words, if it's not President Putin, it's somebody else, or if Russia had been more democratic, would we have seen different behavior? So are they the same, two sides of the same coin? Andrey first.
Well, let me start with saying that, of course, President Putin has a lot of power right now, and the political system is structured in such a way that the president has the final word on very many issues. However, it really depends on what time horizons we have in mind. If we look at the current situation, a country at war, a country in a very profound, fundamental conflict with the West, the name of the game is survival rather than development. Security is by far more important than prosperity. And this is the agenda that President Putin has to deal with. If you take a longer-term future, let's say horizon of 10 or 20 years from now, then the question for Russia is different. It's about how Russia can find its place in the international division of labor, how it can integrate itself into a very different international environment, and how it can change its general attitudes towards the outside world. Because right now, for many Russians, the outside world is perceived as a pretty hostile place, which creates more challenges than opportunities. And this is something that has to change over time, not in 5 years from now.
Okay, we'll come to that, but I think you've answered it in your own way. Cliff, what do you think? President Putin versus the state of Russia?
Well, first, let me thank Dr. Ibtisam for Ben inviting me. I should let everybody know that we met in Russia at the Valdai conference 15 years ago. So even as an American, I can say Russia's done something good. So Putin versus the Russian state. I have trouble making a big distinction. I mean, right now, it's all about Putin. It's one man, one vote, one time. But let me add one thought to that, though. I do think that Russia is stable. It's a very stable place right now, in a way that I find worrisome. I think stability is underappreciated, but it's stable because I think there really is a political system there. It is a kind of an agglomeration of financial and political power centralized on one person. And when we talk about Russia in 10 or 20 years, my fear is that stability, that the system will produce another Putin, somebody like him. And I don't think he's unique. I think that we'll find somebody else from the power structure that will take over in a very sort of authoritarian way.
Okay, well, that's very helpful. That's to start with. Basically, the reason why this was important is to get to the next point. In 2008, Russia invaded Georgia and carved a couple of regions out, broke it. In 2014, it just annexed Crimea. And very soon after that, They supported what people call separatists in both Ukraine as well as Moldova, and then started a war in Ukraine, and importantly, tried to prevent any color revolution in the vicinity, whatever country, what you might call old Soviet Union. And they even interfered with European elections. This is the picture. I wanted to establish whether this is actually what Russia would have felt needed for its national security, or is it, you can even use the terms that reasserting influence over Soviet sphere, or was it a revisionist strategy and building a new Russian empire? So would like to know, if you put in your own words, how that actually is framed in Russia, whether all these things over the last almost 20 years, progressively interventionist and relentlessly so, is this part of a strategy that any president would have done? Or are we going to see a context that will help us even predict the near future? Andrey.
Well, you spoke about the Russian revisionism, and there is a perception that this revisionism is more or less situational, that Russia spots an opportunity and it goes after this opportunity. But I think that this perception is a bit oversimplified. Maybe there is no long-term strategy, but there is clearly a strategic vision that is now dominating the political thinking in the Kremlin and around the Kremlin. And let me limit myself to only 3 points. The first point, reflecting the perceptions of what is going in the world, is that the balance of powers in the world is profoundly changing from the West to the rest. And they like to refer to the balance of powers between the initial BRICS and the G7. BRICS was only one half of G7 20 years ago. Now it more or less leveled with G7, and it will be twice as big as G7 in 20 years from now. But it's not just about the balance of power change. It's about the reluctance of the West to accept what I would call graceful decline. The West, according to the narrative in Moscow, is trying to stick to its former hegemony. That's why we see the West very slow in changing institutions like IMF or EBRD, the paralysis of WTO, attempts to expand NATO, and so on. So that creates tensions and conflicts, including some of the conflicts that you referred to. Second, globalization. I think it would be fair to say that in Russia, globalization is perceived mostly not as a force of nature, as not as a kind of objective trend, but rather as a strategy of mostly cosmopolitan economic and political elites that got completely detached from their constituencies, and therefore Western countries are getting weak and incapable of strong political moves. And I think that the election of Donald Trump is regarded as a confirmation that globalization is over. We are entering a new stage. And it is also a crisis of political liberalism, which can no longer is regarded as a symbol of modernity. There are alternative ways to pursue modernity, and definitely Russia should act on the assumption that the West is not the only game in town. And finally, the perception is that it will be a bumpy road ahead. Let me refer to the statement of Mr. Putin, which he made at the Valdai meeting just a couple of days ago. He said that next 20 years, not 5, not 10, 20 years will be a very difficult time, saturated with crises and conflicts and maybe wars, and we should be ready. That means that we should keep our powder dry. we should invest in our defense. It means that we are back to the Westphalian world. States will remain the main actors in the international system, and Russia should be prepared for this very challenging environment better than its adversaries.
Okay, well, again, a lot of it to do with security or insecurity, and you didn't mention a lot or didn't emphasize the word NATO, which has been used as a pretext or maybe genuine, but I will leave you with a question to think about, but I'm going to go to Cliff. But the question to you is that, do you think the West and the NATO expansion has reached a limit? Do you think Russia does not see that obviously Georgia invasion was on the pretext of wanting to join NATO, Ukraine is the same, and maybe Moldova. So is this real? I mean, is this actual real threat? Is this a perceived one or real one that they are promoting? But Cliff, the first question about this historic track record of this government and your context that you can see.
Essentially, why Russia's foreign policy has been like it is that what you're getting at? I just want to if you could clarify the question a bit.
Well, basically, I mentioned how over the last 20 years, Russia has been on the move.
That's what I thought.
Interfering, invading, acting sometimes as colonial power, sometimes like sentimental about the old days of not just Soviet, but Tsar days. Okay. So whether it's President Putin or whether it's Russia, at the end of the day, they are on the move, they are acting.
I got it.
Yeah.
To me, what's really important is I think President Putin in many ways is post-Soviet Russia. That, I was in the Clinton administration, and we experimented with the idea, as Bob Zoellick did with China, of convergence. That if we supported democratic institutions and supported what are really global aspirations of every country and every people, that Russia would turn into a democracy. And I was part of that, and I believe that, and Strobe Talbot believed that, and Steve Stanovich believed that. I think President Clinton believed that, and we were all wrong. And what we got was the rise of Vladimir Putin. I think that was in part revulsion to the wealth disparities and whatever else happened in the 90s that really turned off average Russians. But what's really struck me over my career, and I've been to, I think, 56 of the Russian regions for lots of complicated reasons, and I don't recommend it to anybody because the quality of the airplanes kind of diminishes the further you get from Moscow. But Putin's popularity has just really always struck me. And one of the things that I always used to love to do is walk into a produkty, a small kind of Russian supermarket, and just start talking to people. And once they realize you're not a crazy person, the popularity of Putin, the genuine admiration, I think, for this combination of strength and smarts, he's a smart guy, leads him to be really popular. So, and then Putin, in turn, led to a very regional great power, regional hegemony, kind of classic, Morgenthau realist concept of a sphere of influence, and he implemented that. I think he was legitimate in Russia at the time. This doesn't cover the war in Ukraine, which is a different story. But I think that's kind of how we got to where we are. It's the popularity of one man who represents what I think is a big centrist constituency.
Right, thank you. Well, Andrey, briefly address that issue of NATO.
Well, over the last 30 years, we had various periods and types of relations with NATO. Back in 1997, we signed NATO-Russia Fundamental Act on cooperation, and we regarded each other as strategic partners. In 2002, they agreed to launch the NATO-Russia Council, and even some 15 years ago, President Medvedev visited NATO. He participated in the summit in Lisbon, and they prepared a common list of threats and challenges. However, I would venture to say that in Russia, they have always been suspicious of NATO. They never really trusted NATO, and in Brussels they never trusted Russia. You could see it just visiting Brussels. I think that the problem is not even in the enlargement of NATO itself, though of course it was a kind of negative factor. But the problem was that what we failed to do in Europe after the end of the Cold War, we failed to put together a comprehensive pan-European security system, which meant that NATO remained essentially the only game in town. And to be out of NATO meant to stay out of the most important decision-making processes on security matters in Europe. So by not being a part of NATO, Russia was kicked out of Europe, so to say. And that was an insult, and that also had very specific political repercussions. The most important decisions that affected Russia's security, like the NATO enlargement, were taken without consultations with Moscow. I think that was one of the reasons why this relationship failed.
Okay, well, Cliff, you tell me, why is it so important for NATO to expand and put pressure on Russia when Russia could have been a member of NATO, had the West been cleverer than this? I don't know if it would have worked out, but the Russians or President Putin have declared it a long time ago that it's NATO, NATO, NATO. Well, NATO could have behaved differently, couldn't they?
Well, before I answer that, let me just make clear that, in my view, Russia illegally invaded Ukraine, and the war should stop as soon as possible, and the land should be returned to Ukraine. And thousands of kids are dying every day. Now, okay, that's done. I've thought for 30 years that expanding NATO was probably a mistake. That the United States had the choice, the West had the choice. And when you look throughout diplomatic history, when you expand an alliance close to a great power, it doesn't usually end well. And Russia never had a chance to join NATO. And, and I'm trying to speak as a political scientist, not as an American. But to me, those are kind of the facts. I made my view known in the Clinton administration. It wasn't very welcome, and hasn't been very welcome for the past years either. But that's my view of NATO enlargement.
Okay, well, I'm going to ask both of you another question. It's not NATO, it's Africa. There is no NATO in Africa. But Russian presence, whether it's military or economic, in so much of Africa is so visible. And in a very similar fashion, obviously there is an economic arm which could be legitimate, could be competing for natural resources, for exporting expertise, and so on, which is fine. But when it's associated with military interventions, protecting regimes, and sending militias like Wagner's and others, this becomes a challenge. Obviously, they may be thinking they are challenging the United States, but after all, this is not Europe, it's nothing to do with NATO, it's to do with Russian strategy, Russian policy in a continent that they could handle it differently. So you put that into context for us.
Well, I think that economically, Russia has a limited number of comparative advantages. It can work with African countries in a couple of areas. But I think that Russia intends to position itself as a security provider. And of course, given the current state of the African continent, given all the crises, all the conflicts which take place there is a security deficit. The question is how to fill it. I think it would be much better for all of us to have some kind of multilateral cooperation, to act under the auspices of the United Nations, but this is not what is going on there. And definitely Russia can claim certain comparative advantages as a security provider. Definitely the West doesn't like it. The West would like to see Russia out of Africa, but there is a demand, and Russia can provide sort of supply.
Cliff, do you have a different view or complementary one?
I think Russia in Africa It's mostly the Central African Republic and the Sahel. In most cases, there are very concrete resource plays that are going on. That the overlay, I think, of Russian policy is as usual to disrupt Western influence, which in this case is mostly French. I don't think it's such a big deal. I think it got a lot of press because it was so interesting under Prigozhin, who wasn't controlled by the Russian state, wasn't controlled by Putin, did his thing, tried to make a run at Putin. I mean, Wagner is a great press story. Now the Ministry of Defense has taken it over, the Russian state's taken it over. I don't think it's all that important. The one thing I do worry about is terrorism in the Sahel. The United States has left Niger, left bases, and I really hope the Russians are paying attention to what I think is a possible global threat coming out of the Sahel and that part of Africa.
Well, thank you. I'm going to come back to Russia, this time in the context of the superpower competition. But before we get into Trump versus Putin, there is this sanction that is really biting, and it's becoming real burden. And also, there is diplomatic isolation. There is the war that is becoming a war of attrition. So the path is a tough one on Russia internally. And obviously, just recalling how President Reagan adopted a strategy against the Soviet Union, they finally decided that if they commit Soviet Union to the heavy expenditure on wars, Star Wars, on strategic missiles and this and that, they eventually make it crumble. And many people credit President Reagan for that strategy, that this marked the end of Soviet era. This is this kind of a scenario that could be repeated here? Do you see this indeed working with the current Russia? Andrey, you're smiling, so you must have a...
Well, let me start with sanctions. Of course, sanctions bite, and I don't think that sanctions can contribute to the economic development of any country. But we have to confess that under sanctions, Russia did exceptionally well over the last 2.5 years. I do recall predictions about Russia imploding, about the Russian economic collapse, and about hyperinflation and things like that. But look at this year, for instance. The Russian economy is likely to grow by approximately 3.9%. It's higher than the US economy, which is performing exceptionally well compared to European nations. I think that the economic bloc of the government turned out to be quite professional and quite efficient. Of course, if you look at the predictions, IMF argues that we will see a major decline of the growth next year, but they make these predictions every year and then they correct their initial forecasts. In terms of isolation, again, I would clearly qualify this perception because Russia might be isolated from its former Western partners. But look at the recent BRICS summit in Kazan. Dozens of foreign leaders, major countries of the global south were there. International institutions came there, including the United Nations Secretary General. So I think that it is difficult, if possible, to isolate a country like Russia. It has to pay a price for the conflict. It's not easy, but isolation is probably too strong a term to describe the current position of Russian Federation in the global system.
Cliff, you would love to look beyond the sanctions, but let's talk about the sanctions and then beyond that. It's yours.
I mean, I think Andrey is a little rosy about the Russian economy. It's performing, but it's warped. It's just kind of all muscular in weird ways. Everything is devoted to military production. And once you warp an economy like that, you try to take it off the steroids, it's kind of hard to take it off first. Secondly, interest rates are what, 17.5% now? They're really high. The Russian economy is really overheated. They have a big inflation problem. So I do think there has been an effect. That said, I think we all, as kind of social scientists, have to. It's interesting. Sanctions have underperformed. I mean, this was one of the most ruthless, widespread, ruthless is the wrong word because it's appropriate, but biting, as you put it, regimes in the history of sanctions. And we have seen a porous sanctions regime. We've seen Russia grow. It wasn't what I think the Biden administration expected. To me, a lot of the reason for that, and an undercovered fact, is as bad as the general staff has been, the economic team in Russia, Nabulina, Silvanov, Oreshkin, it's kind of the A-plus team. And few countries, and they've stayed, maybe because they have to, but for whatever reason they've stayed, I think few countries that I know have a top list of economic officials that good. So this is not Ronald Reagan 2.0.
Well, thank you both. Now I'm going to switch to the topical issue. Andrey, did Mr. Trump make that phone call to Mr. Putin?
It has been officially denied, so...
What do you think he would have said if he had made that phone call?
Well, the Washington Post reported on this alleged call, saying that, first of all, Trump warned Putin about potential escalation of the conflict, warned him against escalation by the Russian side. Maybe he expressed his concerns about the Russian offensive. He also argued that the United States has certain leverage. Again, allegedly, according to the Post, he referred to the U.S. military presence in Europe that might trigger a direct confrontation between Moscow and Washington. And finally, he expressed his interest in contributing to a peace settlement. That is the story reported by the U.S. newspaper. Later on, the Kremlin flatly denied that such a conversation took place, and moreover, the Putin's spokesman argued that they do not have such a conversation in their nearest plans, unless Trump takes the initiative to call the Russian leader. But definitely these contacts will evolve over time. Maybe it will happen long before the inauguration. At least informal conversations are quite possible. And the big question is whether they can reach an agreement which would allow both of them claim victory. And that will not be easy.
That's very clear. Thank you. Cliff, would a just mere ceasefire would constitute a big credit and big success to Mr. Trump for 4 years? Or would he be ambitious enough to say, I'm going to stop the war and engage President Putin with, obviously, carrot and stick concession as well as leverages? Or do you think he would want more, like completely reversing whatever gains that Russia's made? What do you think would constitute a major success if in 4 years' time Mr. Trump looks back?
Well, I don't think that Trump, Vance, Incorporated plan on pushing Russia out of the territory that they are in. I mean, Vance has been, his peace plan is pretty public. So I think what would constitute a major victory for Trump in his own mind, probably in the American electorate's mind, is stopping the war for a period of time. Period. The problem is that I'm very mixed, kind of unclear on balance. It's a very close call whether Putin will stop the war. We've talked about that previously. I'd love to know what Andrey thinks. I don't. On the one hand, he's winning the war, period. And we can talk about the front line. He's winning the war. Why would he stop now? And Trump will need to convince him to stop while he's winning. It's very hard to stop a guy who almost lost the war and now is winning to stop. That's the challenge.
But if we look at the major stakeholders here, the United States clearly is still committed to providing support to Ukraine. During this transition, the Democrats are still in charge. We don't know exactly how the next administration will behave, but at least there is an ongoing commitment as the United States concerned. But there's also Europe. They might have their own agendas and mind of their own, but even in Europe, you can see fragmentation, you can see some kind of lethargy that Russia might take advantage of and the Ukrainians might be frustrated about. So combining the newcomer with the existing situation and the Russian drive to continue without really slowing down, what is the prospect here? I want to start with maybe Cliff, you first, and then Andrey, yourself.
All in, I think the prospect for a ceasefire is pretty good. That Trump, it's a big deal for Trump. I mean, he kind of ran on this thing. It's one of the things he's best known for. And he is very self-conscious of his image. So I think he'll spend, to the extent he'll spend time on foreign policy, and I think we'll have to remember that the economy and immigration are what he got elected on and what he'll focus on. This will be one of the things he'll really focus on. On balance, you know, I mean, Ukraine has an extreme manpower problem now. That's why they're having trouble holding the front. Russia doesn't, but I think they will starting end of next year. Russia can't recruit 25 to 35,000, you know, people a month and pay them on contracts. It gets very expensive. So as I think about the balance of equities and the extent to which Putin will want to invest in Trump, because that's a good relationship for him, it's a longer story, I think we'll get a ceasefire for a year maybe. That's my view.
Andrey.
Well, Putin has his wish list. So there are certain demands that he would like to put on the table for regions of Ukraine. You know, Ukraine out of NATO forever, demilitarization, denazification of the country, lifting sanctions. So it's a long list. And the big question is whether there is any flexibility, whether there can be a compromise. Because if you imagine that all these conditions are met, it's a clear defeat, not only for Ukraine, it's a defeat for the West. And this is hardly something what Trump is ready to swallow. On the other hand, the big question here is who really suffers from this conflict? I think first and foremost it is Ukraine, because the country is being destroyed, and it's not clear how it can be rebuilt after the conflict is over. It is Russia, and I agree with Cliff that the price might go up, and that will have an impact on the economic performance and on the social stability. Maybe next year, maybe 2026, but definitely there are certain limits, and we should not forget about them. And finally, it is Europe, because it is a European problem. It is not so much an American problem, in my opinion. To some extent, one can argue that the United States indirectly benefited from this war, because this war helped the United States to consolidate the quote-unquote collective West under its leadership. It allowed the United States to sell more natural gas, or rather shale gas, to Europe. It created certain benefits. It also allowed the United States to capture defense markets in Europe and elsewhere. So does it mean that the United States can wait? Probably it can wait unless it has to confront a clear victory by the Russian side. So from this viewpoint, I think the question for Russia would be how sustainable such a ceasefire might be, because we had this experience with the so-called Minsk agreements, which were violated on both sides more than once. And definitely this is not the end game that the Russian leadership would like to see. They would like to see something more stable, and something which will not be limited to Ukraine only, but something that would include an arrangement on the future European architecture. And that makes this equation even more difficult, because if it's not only about Ukraine, but about Europe, you have to bring all Europeans to the table, and you should have an agreement on many fundamental issues on which there is no agreement, for the time being at least.
Can I just add something here quickly? I think Andrei's got at the critical issue here, which is that what kind of a ceasefire? Russia won't agree to an unconditional ceasefire. That'll be the American goal, that'll be the Ukrainian goal. So how much space does Trump have to give Putin what he wants? And is there a Venn diagram that overlaps? But the broader point I want to make here is there's been some discussion here so far that Trump has a free hand with Russia, and I think that's dead wrong. There's an American body politic that has equated Russia with evil, kind of with Darth Vader. And Trump did carry, I think he will carry both houses. He'll control the Republican Party. But there is just so far that Republicans can vote. You can't lift sanctions. We can get to that if you want. And you can't kind of give away Ukraine's future, or he'll get pilloried by his own party. So I just want to, I think, correct the notion that and again, I don't think there'll be a state dinner anytime soon. That's my own view, at least in the United States. So.
Okay, well, something that reminds us about Afghanistan. It was Mr. Trump who asked somebody to go and get it done. And the negotiations went in a way that the last people who were consulted were actually the government of Afghanistan. So it was done between the United States and Taliban. Now the mindset, or at least the discussion, the way it goes, as though what does the United States do with Russia about Ukraine? Whereas it's all about Ukraine versus Russia. The ceiling that you just described, Andrey, that Russia has for discussions and negotiations is impossible, impossibly high. So there has to be compromise. But then the other side is Ukraine. For them, it's impossible to sign an eternal document forever, forgetting about Crimea, Donbass, this, that. So where is the compromise? Is it really feasible to get anywhere within the term of Mr. Trump into a realistic one, with Mr. Trump really negotiating with both Europe, Ukraine, as well as Russia?
Well, I think that if there is political will, there is a way. And let me remind you of the so-called Istanbul negotiations that took place right in the beginning of this conflict. And the two sides made a lot of progress, including the territorial issue. They agreed that they could put this issue on a back burner, but Ukraine allegedly promised that it wouldn't use the military force to try to recapture Crimea or Donbass. So it is possible, in theory at least. But I think that to some extent the Ukrainian leadership has become a hostage to its own success. They created so high expectations in the society that they should recapture all the territory and they should reconstitute their sovereignty in the borders of 1991, that it is not easy to take a more moderate position to say that, look, some issues have to wait. We cannot resolve them right now. We still hope that they will be resolved at some point, but let us leave this issue to some future generations of leaders. For Volodymyr Zelensky, it is particularly difficult because he was so articulate in defending his positions and the so-called Zelensky plan. Okay.
Cliff, you're very experienced in negotiations. Don't know about mediations, but what do you think about this impossible kind of counter-argument?
Well, you know, I mean, Ukraine's a lovely country with a very innovative people that deserves better. Someday I think it'll get better. For right now, so first of all, Ukrainian domestic public opinion has changed from no talks to supporting talks, but without giving away land. So there's been some easing in the pressure on Zelensky to hold to the firm line. But I think the bigger point is that if this military dynamic keeps up, I think Russia will take more land in Donetsk. I expect there to be an attack within the next couple of months in Zaporizhia to the south. none of the lines are being firmly manned right now, from what I hear from my colleagues who are kind of on the scene. I think at some point next year, Zelensky probably will welcome Trump forcing him to make a deal. Now that's kind of a little ruthless, but that's my view of the dynamic of the situation right now. And that, to be blunt, eases the diplomatic lift. I think there's, kind of a tragic opening, I would say.
Well, thank you very much. I'm going to ask for questions. I already have a couple here, but before taking the first round, I'm going to ask one final thing about multipolarity and looking east. Does Russia actually recognize that it's no longer a superpower? It's maybe qualifies as a middle power, but there is China. There's also other similar middle powers emerging. How do they relate to Russia? Because they must have both complementarity and contradictions, i.e. competition in many places. So how do you characterize that relationship with the East?
Well, in terms of great power, superpower, regional power, it really depends on the dimension of the international influence that you're talking about. If you are looking at the strategic dimension, at nuclear forces, Russia remains a strategic superpower, which can be compared only to the United States, not even to China. But of course, in terms of its economy, in terms of some other dimensions of power, it cannot qualify as a superpower. In terms of specifically of the Russian-Chinese relations, there are speculations that Russia will become a junior partner in this alliance. But my sense is that in Beijing, they don't like junior partners. They don't like junior partners because to turn a country into a junior partner, you should take certain commitments and the responsibilities for the future of the country. Even North Korea can hardly be qualified as China's junior partner. So I think that we will see a very complex relationship between Russia, China, and India. I think Russia will try to sort of keep a balance between Beijing and Delhi, trying maybe to assist the two nations in managing their relations, though I think it's hardly possible. But these old notions of superpowers and even great powers might get obsolete. Look at South Korea. It is a relatively small country, but in terms of trade, it by far surpasses Russia. So everything is relative in this postmodern world.
Cliff, your thoughts?
Well, first, I'd just like us all to be aware that strategic nuclear arms control is dead. It was about to expire under Biden. Trump doesn't believe in it, and time's running out. So I think we should all just fathom a world with no control over nuclear weapons, because we're all going to live in it after 2026. That's my first point. More broadly, when I think about Russia long term, I think about a really asymmetric middle power in the following sense, that this is going to be a country that I think will be cut off from the global financial system for the foreseeable future. Sanctions aren't going anywhere. It will be cut off from Silicon Valley, the source of much of global dynamism, next generation technology for the foreseeable future. It's going to be very hard to make a living. On the other hand, Russia, when it turns the other direction, and some of Andrei's more conservative colleagues are writing about kind of turning around the Titanic and the experiment of Russia having its back to Europe and its front, east and south. I mean, can that work? I don't know. But what is interesting, I think, is, again, Russia's relationships with Asia, with China, with India, and with this region, where from the UAE to Saudi, to Iran, to OPEC+, to Syria, Russia is still very influential. So, can Russia make it in its sort of what will be post-ceasefire world? It's a really interesting experiment that I don't think diplomatic history provides any experiment to, any analog to.
Okay, well, gives us 15 minutes exactly for questions and answers. We haven't spoken about Iran or Russia versus Iran or the Gulf, but I'm going to ask an Iranian to ask his question. He's been waiting, and that's Aghay Saeed Sajjadpur, followed by a Bahraini who is from the Gulf. So you need those two questions. Let's see what they are. Please go ahead.
Thank you. A very interesting discussion, and I do appreciate. Actually, I have a question for both, and that is, as we heard today morning, there is a type of constructed alliance between Iran, China, Russia, and North Korea in the Western strategic writings these days, as was pronounced by one of the speakers today morning. But in reality, of course, we have a good bilateral relationship between China and Russia, between China and Iran, between China and North Korea. But such alliances is of no really real meaning in practice. So if that is the case, why there is such a type of pronouncements in strategic writings that there is an access, there is an alliance, and so on and so forth. So what's the intention beyond it? What is the nature of it, and where it goes? Isn't it a type of addiction in the West to a dichotomy of that we have, goods and bads, evil and,
Thank you.
The righteous. So I would be more than happy to see
Thank
your
you very
views.
much. Hassan al-Hassan from Bahrain, I promised you. Your
Thank you
name
very
has been
much.
there for a long time. Where are you?
Thank you. I'm right here,
Okay.
to the right of the panel. So my question is, maybe a bit of context first, and it's addressed mostly
But
to...
a short context, please.
Absolutely.
Go straight to the
Dr.
question.
Kortunov. The bit of context is this. The Gulf states adopted a fairly neutral position on the question of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. They condemned it at the UN level, but in reality, they chose not to enforce Western sanctions against Russia. Part of this calculus was an attempt to build leverage over Moscow, in my personal analysis, in order to restrain Russian cooperation with Iran. My sense is that most of the Gulf states probably believe that that strategy has failed. What do you make of claims and allegations that the Russians are actually providing the Houthis with weapons and military assistance? Do you think these are credible? And what would Russia's motivations be beyond pestering the West? And if so, do you think this will have broader repercussions on Russia's relations with the Arab Gulf states? Thank you.
Thank you. Francis Gores.
Thank you. It looks like we're heading into a situation of downward pressure on oil prices, and I'm just wondering what the panelists think Russia's view of OPEC Plus and the restraints that OPEC Plus imposes on Russian production decisions will be going forward.
Thank you. And Marek Matusiak.
Hello? Okay. I have a question to Mr. Kortunov. You've mentioned in the first part of your speech that Russia welcomes the emergence of alternative models of modernity, that the Western model is no longer the only game in town. So my question to you would be, what does Russia have to contribute to the world in terms of modernity when it comes to political standards, legal standards, good governments, economic model, its contribution to world affairs? Where is modernity? That's the modern aspect that Russia can really contribute. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. I'll turn to you at your leisure. You listen to the questions. You can be picky, you can be holistic. Andrey.
Well,
a lot of them were directed to you, except what I think Sajjadpur was meaning, the American. You go ahead.
Well, first of all, I'm very glad to see Dr. Sajjadpur here. Let me say that I think it's natural for a human being to think about life in binary terms, us against them, good against evil, white against black, and so on and so forth. And I think it exists on both sides, which of course simplifies the picture. And if I were to compare the East and the West, this axis with the Western alliance, of course, I should conclude that the Western alliance is much more institutionalized. If you look at the countries that you mentioned, each of these countries is very sensitive about its sovereignty, its independence, and all of them are reluctant to join binding alliances. This is probably one of the reasons why we are still working on the strategic partnership agreement with the Islamic Republic, which some of us hoped to have signed already early this year, but they're still working on that. That suggests that it's not that easy to find some kind of common denominator, even on the bilateral level, not to mention multilateral. In terms of the Gulf states and their relations with Russia, my personal take is that the Gulf states took a position that they took primarily because they had a couple of specific interests related to their potential cooperation with Moscow. And one of these interests is, of course, the OPEC plus format, where Russia continues to make significant cuts in its oil production together with the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, together with United Arab Emirates and other OPEC members. I think that some Gulf states profit from turning themselves into financial hubs for the Russian Federation. Although, of course, these activities contain certain risks and do not come without a price to be paid. But if you look at the Iranian equation, let me just mention that, in my opinion, if you look at long-term trends, I think there is a continuous, maybe very slow, maybe not always stable, but there is a rapprochement between Arab states of the Gulf and the Islamic Republic. And I hope that Russian-Iranian relations will not be a major obstacle on the way of cooperation between Russia and Gulf states. And in terms of modernity, it's definitely an interesting question. When I was mentioning modernity, I didn't really mean Russia, which has to learn a lot about modernity, in my opinion. I meant some other examples, including, of course, China, to some extent India, as potential alternative models of modernity, which will be different from how we understand Western models. Russia has to work a lot in order to become a significant contributor to global commons. I think it will take time.
Cliff, your take.
Well, first, Kazim, it's a really good question. And I do think that the series of bilateral relationships is not an alliance, clearly. There's much more done on the bilateral level. There's almost nothing done on the multilateral level. So I think that's accurate. But there are issues involved. There are risks involved for the West. I mean, first, it is one of the major, set of bilateral relationships, whatever you want to call it, that balances Western power. When you have China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea, increasing, working together, seeming to work together, it really is kind of, along with the BRICS, I think it's one of two major balancing formations against Western power. And therefore, I think politicians and analysts in the West are right to take it seriously. That's on a macro level. On a more detailed level, you've had Iran providing ballistic missiles and drones. You have North Korea providing missiles to Russia. And now you see this dramatic reality of 10,000 North Korean troops fighting with the Russians. And so the outcome and you know, the implications of North Korea entering the battle, I think are really quite real and something that any Western policymaker, you know, would have to come to terms with. Secondly, you know, Russia against the West. And as a non-Trump voter, I kind of hate to get into kind of the good parts of Donald Trump's election, but this Russia versus NATO thing is getting really, really dangerous. I don't know how accurate the Wall Street Journal piece about Russia providing, you know, targeting information to the Houthis was, but it sure made a good read. It sure read credible to me. You know, these instances of arson across Russia, which responsible European governments across Europe are blaming on Russia. The reality that Russia has interfered with civilian aviation GPS systems in Latvia. So if you fly into the Baltics, you have to be scared about your plane's, you know, GPS system now. I mean, I think Russia against the West is and the actions that Russia would take, you know, in theory, if Harris had been elected president, are getting very scary. So I think that's one, you know, silver lining to the election, possibly.
Thank you very much. Just a final 30-second each. Just a few words to see you agree with some or all of the above. Geopolitical ambition, nationalism, imperial nostalgia, or place in the history in Russia. Which ones, if you had to choose?
Well,
you could say all of the above.
Well, generally all of the above, that depends on particular stratum of the Russian society.
Yeah.
I think what we're seeing now that makes the most difference for Russia is place in history, legacy. To me, what happened with Mr. Putin, you know, I've had the opportunity to spend some time around, is that he got older. You know, we're all getting older. Every day we get older. But you know, he's, what, 71 now? 72, 71, 72. And I think he genuinely did not want to leave the Ukraine problem to the next generation. And so in his quest for a legacy, he made a tragic mistake and invaded Ukraine. But to me, it's mostly about place in history.
Okay. Isn't it nice to finish ahead of time sometimes, not on time? So now it's actually 2.5 minutes ahead of time, but I want to thank you, both of you, for this wonderful insights that you provided, for tolerating my questions, and for the audience to have stayed with us and engaged, and thank them in the usual way.